Okay, so we're going to try to unpack this. You send over some pretty fascinating analysis, and it's of a Manchester City versus Crystal Palace football match.
Mm.
And it looks like we've got kind of a match report summary that uses a whole bunch of statistical models
Right?
and probabilities and even some betting
Yeah.
recommendations. And then it's got some simulation results and some goal predictions.
Mhm.
And then even it looks at the accuracy of these models in the past.
Mhm.
So
Right.
our mission here is to kind of dive deep into all these numbers and figure out like what they really tell you about this game.
Absolutely. And it even goes a step further by providing some closing remarks and some disclaimers
Yeah.
by the group that did it, which is called the Gamblers Ruin Project.
Okay.
So we'll touch on those maybe a little bit towards the end.
Yeah.
But as you said, the core of our discussion will be to really make sense of the predictions for you, the listener.
Right. So let's just dive right in and look at these main probabilities.
Okay.
So the model is putting Manchester City's chance of winning at 60.21%, the probability of a draw at 23.42%, and a Crystal Palace win at just 16.36%.
Right.
So in practical terms, when you just look at those numbers,
Yeah.
what kind of picture does that paint of how this game is likely to go?
Well, I think the easiest way for you to think about these percentages is that they are essentially an informed guess
Okay.
based on a huge amount of data.
Okay.
Um, if this exact match were to be played over and over and over again under very similar circumstances, the model estimates that Manchester City would win in roughly 6 out of every 10 of those games.
Gotcha.
So on the other hand, Crystal Palace winning is considered a much less frequent outcome according to the analysis.
Right. So it's not a guarantee, but it's like the model's best guess
Exactly.
based on its
So
data.
it's a likelihood, yeah.
Yeah, it's like saying if you were betting on this game
Right,
repeatedly,
right.
the odds are that City would be the more reliable pick.
Yep.
Just based on these numbers.
Yeah.
Now, the analysis also gives these ranges, though, too, right?
Yeah.
It gives these confidence intervals.
Right.
So for a Manchester City win, it's between 63.71% and 76.72%.
Wow.
For a draw, it's 12.91 to 23.94.
Uh-huh.
And for Crystal Palace win, it's 6.85 to 15.87.
Okay.
Why do they give these ranges, and what should you take away from those about how certain the model is?
Well, one of the nice things that these confidence intervals do for you
Yeah,
is that they highlight the uncertainty that's inherent in any prediction.
right.
So the model isn't claiming that the probability of a City win is precisely 60.21%.
Okay.
Instead, it's saying, based on the data and the calculations, the true probability likely falls within that broader range that they give.
Gotcha.
So think of it as like the model saying we're not 100% sure that it's exactly this number,
Uh-huh.
but we're quite confident it's somewhere in this ballpark.
Okay.
So if you have a narrower range like we do with Manchester City winning, that suggests there's more confidence in that prediction.
Right.
Whereas if you have a wider range like we see with the draw, that indicates that there's more variability in the possible outcomes.
Okay, so the ranges kind of give you a sense of the wiggle room.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The potential for things to deviate from that single point estimate.
Yeah. Okay, so it's not like laser focus. It's more like a likely zone.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a really useful way to think about it.
Yeah.
Now, this is where things get really interesting to me.
Okay.
Because despite that seemingly, strong 60% probability that Manchester City's going to win,
Right.
the betting recommendation is Kelly criterion. No bet recommended.
Yeah.
So that to me sounds completely backwards.
Right.
So can you break down why a bet isn't recommended,
Sure.
even when the model favors a team so heavily?
Yeah, this brings up a really important concept for you to understand.
Okay.
And that is the difference between the likelihood of something happening
Okay.
versus whether it's actually a smart bet.
Okay.
So even though the model believes that Manchester City is quite likely to win, the odds that bookmakers are offering on that outcome
Uh-huh.
might be so low that, according to the Kelly criterion,
Okay.
there's no real value in placing that bet.
Okay.
So essentially what the Kelly criterion is it's a formula that helps you determine the optimal amount to bet
Okay.
based on your perceived probability of winning and the odds that you're getting.
Gotcha.
So if the potential profit relative to the risk
Okay.
and the probability is not high enough,
Yeah.
the Kelly criterion will advise against placing a bet, even on a likely winner.
So it's not just about who is going to win, it's about whether the potential payout is worth it,
Exactly, yeah.
given the probability.
Ah.
Okay, that's a really important distinction.
Yeah, and the model here is essentially saying, yes, City is probably going to win,
Right.
but the odds are such that you're not likely to make a profit in the long run
Okay.
if you keep placing bets like this.
So it's about finding these situations where the bookmaker's odds underestimate the true probability?
Exactly. It's finding those mismatches between what the model thinks and what the market thinks.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to the Monte Carlo simulation.
Okay.
So they basically ran this game 10,000 times in a computer.
Wow.
And the results are very close to those initial probabilities.
Okay.
So Manchester City wins in 60.13% of the simulations, draws in 22.91, and Crystal Palace wins in 16.96.
Uh-huh.
So how do those simulated results either back up or contradict those first calculations?
I think one of the most compelling things here
Yeah.
is how closely those results of the Monte Carlo simulation align with the initial probability calculations.
Right.
So think of it like this. You're running the match 10,000 times.
Yeah.
You're getting almost identical percentages for each outcome.
Okay.
And that provides really strong reinforcement for
Right.
those initial figures.
So it's kind of like a second opinion.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like getting a second opinion, but instead of asking another analyst, you're asking thousands of virtual matches.
Right. And they're all saying the same thing.
Exactly. And that adds a lot of robustness, I think, to the initial prediction.
Yeah.
As the source itself points out, it confirms their prediction.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, the analysis also uses something called Poisson regression
Okay.
to predict how many goals each team might score. And they've got Manchester City at an expected 1.90 goals and Crystal Palace at an expected 0.60 goals.
Right.
So when a team has an expected goal value of less than one, like Crystal Palace here, what does that mean?
For you, that essentially means that according to the model, that team is not expected to score even a single goal on average
Okay.
in that particular match.
Gotcha.
So for Crystal Palace, an expected goal figure of 0.60 suggests that the model is predicting
Yeah.
that they're going to score a goal in this match less than 60% of the time.
Okay.
So it really highlights the model's assessment of Manchester City's defensive strength and the likelihood that Crystal Palace is going to have a very hard time finding the back of the net.
So it's not saying that they absolutely won't score.
Right.
But statistically, the most likely scenario is that they don't.
Exactly.
Right? So it just sets up an expectation.
Yeah.
And in this case, the expectation is Crystal Palace is going to have a tough time scoring.
Exactly.
Now, based on this Poisson model, they've also given us the most likely score lines.
Okay.
So talking the list, a 1-0 Manchester City win at 15.60%.
Okay.
Followed by 2-0 City at 14.82%. 3-1 City at 9.38%. A 1-1 draw at 9.36%, and a 2-1 to City at 8.89%.
Gotcha.
So just looking at those top score lines, what are the key things that jump out to you?
I think the main takeaways from these most likely score lines are very telling.
Okay.
So first, all of the most probable outcomes are all Manchester City victories.
Yeah.
1-0 and 2-1 are the most likely specific results.
Okay.
Second, even the most probable draw scenario, which is that 1-1 result, has a slightly lower probability than the top two Manchester City wins. And third, if you were to add up the probabilities of all those Manchester City wins score lines that are listed, it would significantly outweigh the combined probability of a draw or a Crystal Palace win.
Right.
So this really reinforces the overall picture of a likely and potentially comfortable Manchester City victory.
Right. It really seems like all of the data is pointing in one direction.
It really does.
Now, the report also has some interesting information about how accurate different statistical models have been in the past when predicting these kinds of games. So they used a technique called cross-validation.
Right.
And it looks like the random forest model performed slightly best with an accuracy of 56.32%. But other models like Bagging Ensemble and the Neural Network were really close at around 55.79%.
Gotcha.
And even the lowest accuracy from the Bayesian classifier was still 53.68%.
Okay.
So across the board, we're looking at around 54 to 56% average accuracy.
Right.
What does that level of accuracy tell you about how much faith you should put in these predictions?
Yeah. It's important to remember that these are just probabilities.
Right.
And they're informed estimates.
Yeah.
But the unexpected can always happen in a single game.
Right.
So while a 54 to 56% accuracy shows that these are sophisticated tools that can predict outcomes better than random chance, they're by no means perfect.
Right.
So essentially what that means is that in roughly half of the previous matches that these models were tested against, the actual result was different from what the model predicted was most likely.
Right.
So this underscores the unpredictability of football.
Yeah.
And it highlights that even the most advanced statistical models have limitations.
They're not guarantees.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they provide valuable insights into the probabilities and potential scenarios, but they're not guarantees of what will happen.
Okay, so bringing it all together, let's look at the final verdict from the Gambler's Ruin Project. They say Manchester City should win comfortably. However, bookmaker odds are not offering enough value to justify a recommended bet. The most probable outcome is a 1-0 or 2-0 win for Manchester City.
Right.
So let's just break those key conclusions down.
Okay, so if we kind of tie everything together, the analysis is strongly leaning towards a Manchester City victory. And this is supported by multiple different statistical methods.
Okay.
You know, the initial probability calculations, the Monte Carlo simulations with thousands of virtual games.
Right.
And even the Poisson regression, which predicts City scoring significantly more goals. However, the key takeaway, especially if you're thinking about placing a bet, is that the betting market has likely already factored in Manchester City's high probability of winning.
Okay.
This means that the odds being offered might not be attractive enough to represent good value.
Gotcha.
According to betting strategies like the Kelly criterion.
Right.
So even though the model confidently predicts a City win, the financial perspective, as determined by the bookmaker's odds, suggests that it might not be a worthwhile bet.
So really understanding the probabilities is just one part of the equation.
Exactly.
Whether you're considering a bet
or
you're just trying to understand the game's dynamics.
Right.
Now, before we wrap up, we should just briefly mention those disclaimers.
Yes, it's vital that you're aware that the source explicitly states that this entire analysis is for informational purposes only.
Okay.
And that the predictions are generated by AI models. They also include some very important reminders about the need for responsible gambling.
Okay.
And they even provide contact information for support organizations dealing with gambling addiction in both North America and the UK.
Yeah, they're very careful to cover their bases.
Exactly. And they also emphasize that this is not financial or betting advice.
Right.
That there are no guarantees of specific outcomes. And that it's your responsibility to ensure that you're complying with all local laws regarding sports betting.
Right, it's all on you.
Yeah, these disclaimers are important to highlight the speculative nature of any prediction.
Of course, yeah.
And the need to engage with this type of information responsibly.
Right. So what does this all mean for you?
Yeah.
This deep dive into the analysis shows you how sophisticated statistical models can be applied to predict outcomes of football matches.
Yeah.
And they provide insight into probabilities of different results.
Right.
The most likely score lines, and even a perspective on the value of placing a bet.
And what's fascinating is the level of detail these models go into.
Right.
You know, they simulate thousands upon thousands of matches. They try to forecast the most probable number of goals.
Right.
So it really makes you think, how much weight should you give to this kind of data when you're forming your own opinions or making your own decisions, even if those decisions aren't about betting at all?
This look into predictive modeling in sports, I think it offers you a glimpse into a world where data is increasingly informing our expectations.
It really does.
It really does. And it prompts us to consider how these tools can enhance our understanding of complex situations. But also, it reminds us that there are these inherent uncertainties involved in predicting future outcomes.
Of course.
As we saw with those model accuracy rates.
Yeah.
So maybe this makes you wonder how these modeling techniques are going to continue to evolve and be applied to other fields far beyond sports.
It really does make you wonder.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, this has been fascinating.
Yeah, I agree.
Thanks for bringing this analysis to our attention.
It's a pleasure to discuss it.
It's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's really cool stuff.
Okay. Until next time.
See you later.
Bye.